Oh hey, I'm glad you're here. This is the last mini episode between season 5 and 6. Thank you for listening as we've enjoyed being able to provide a different format, highlighting more fantastic people and their relations to films. If you've not subscribed, I hope you will, as I would hate for you to miss out on an episode of this next season. There are even more wonderful guests and underseen films. But let's take a second to address this mini. JL, my friend and the producer of VHS, told me about this person, and I didn't even put together that I'd already heard his podcast. I love people's individual passions. I love how they often start with a small moment, and then we all collect and build out a bigger picture. And from that single spark, we build something that helps us understand ourselves more. So without further ado, please enjoy this bonus episode of VH Us. Hello, and welcome to VH Us, the podcast where each episode is about a film and the guest has the profession portrayed in the film. I'm your host, Dirk Marshall, and normally that is our format. However, while we're on break between seasons, we wanted to offer some bonus episodes in October. As a podcast that celebrates films and people's individual lives, we'd like to also celebrate other people who use their voice to champion the films that mean something to them. Today's guest is a fantastic, some might say, obsessive example of such a person. Shawn Robare, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Is that right, Robare?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was going to check it ahead of time, but once again did it in the intro. I have to shout out my producer, J.L. Watkins, who's a Little Lost Robot on Instagram, as he told me about you, and that when he traverses the world, he keeps an eye out for Lost Boys things for me, as we have a Lost Boys lounge here in the studio, and for Monster Squad things for you. And Shawn, you're here for a specific reason, but I also wanted to shout out some of your other ongoings. Would you mind telling us about Branded in the 80s?
Sure. That's a podcast that by podcast and a website that I started about 14 years ago. Basically, it's a place where I can talk about all the stuff that I was in love with as a kid, all the pop culture stuff, cartoons, comic books, toys, all that kind of stuff. And I use it as a way to kind of try to break down like where I'm at today and where, where I was then, where I'm at today. And there's got to be a connection between the two. So much of the stuff that I loved when I was a kid has a huge impact on my life now. And so I kind of like digging into the little corners of that nostalgia and stuff like that. I try to do stuff that's a little bit more obscure sometimes, or take a different kind of bend on it. I don't just talk about toys straight up or whatever, but it's sort of like how a certain toy affected me and, yada, yada, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I listened to the podcast today. It was the Silverhawks episode. And it was lovely because it's just 12 minutes. It's a nice story. I really appreciated the tone of it all. And being someone who spent my life trying to convince people that this cartoon even existed, it was a great little celebration of that.
Yeah, that's I really like hitting on stuff that, again, it's a little bit more obscure, not necessarily like super obscure, but and if nothing else, I like bringing a personal point of view to it. I'm heavily influenced by there's a guy that runs a site called The Retroist, and he just has he's had a podcast for a really long time, but he just has a really good way of making everything more personal and not just sitting there and, wow, this is so cool and this is so awesome, and it's like, okay, yeah, but what does it mean to you? That kind of a thing. So, and then with the podcast too, I try to keep it short, and it's very irregular. I did it way back 14 years ago. I did like 20 episodes. And then recently, I kind of like in the last few years, I've kind of brought it back, and I've had like short little runs with it. And again, I try to dig into stuff that, not everybody always thinks about. So thank you for listening, by the way.
Yeah, of course. I think that's a great way to do something like that, because then you're not just mining endlessly and then being like, is there a nerve in this, or am I just listing off like the rarest Smurf items?
Exactly. Or it's like I don't want to sound like I'm reading from a Wikipedia article, or it's like, oh yeah, this is the cast, and it's like, yeah, okay, but
right. Well, and just in that 12-minute episode, I think it was 12 minutes. You mentioned Albertsons and the toy aisle and things that I'm actually I was born 10 days after you, so we're similar ages, as close as possible, really. And so I remember grocery stores having actual toy aisles and not just the disc guns and cap guns and things like that. So it brought a lot back. I was like, oh my gosh, it really was a nice sort of stroll through. So
Cool. That's definitely what I aim for. So
yeah, that's great. And then what is Cult Film Club?
Cult Film Club is I have a huge love of film, and my wife and I share a very similar kind of cross section of movies, and same with a friend I've had for a long time. So we got together and we decided to start a podcast where we were just going to talk about the movies that we really love to death, and we call it the Cult Film Club, and we kind of dip into cult film. It's not like super culty. Sometimes a lot of the stuff we talk about is actually very pop culture heavy or very popular, but it's stuff that really had a huge impact on us that like we can just sit down like our comfort movies we watch a million times. So again, it's sort of irregular, kind of monthly, but we try to hit on all kinds of weird and fun stuff like The Last Dragon or The Worst Witch,
Yes.
Rad, Monster Squad, stuff like that, Troll 2.
Yeah, I listened to today the Highlander episode.
Okay.
And something that I think is so interesting about a podcast like yours is that there's some facts in there, um, and it seems very well researched, but also you have the personal taste angle and just the memories involved. Because for me, growing up in my dad's video store, Highlander was massive. And
Mm-hmm.
then for you and your friends to be talking about that it wasn't very successful when it came out blows my mind because in my head it was like the biggest thing for years to come.
Yeah. Well, that's a weird thing too, is that especially like in the video store days, I'm like 80s, early 90s kind of era. I'm not sure when your folks had a video store.
Right when it initially was VCR repair and rentals and
Okay.
camcorders. So when the market hit, it was it switched to
Okay.
rentals as well.
So, like these days, everyone's so conscious and heavy of how much a movie costs, what the budget is, how much did the box office for the first 2 weeks, blah, blah, blah. But like in the 80s, like, there was a little bit of awareness for that in terms of, was a movie big or not? Was it being covered on Siskel and Ebert and whatnot? But people didn't really have an idea for like how popular a movie could be on VHS. We didn't have the internet. And so, hundreds of people, thousands, millions, whatever, would rent a movie, but maybe only like three people you knew saw it, it seems like, or whatever. It's like you didn't really
Yeah.
get a feel for the popularity or whatever. So I'm sure from the perspective of being behind the counter when you're renting those and everyone's like renting Highlander a ton, um it's interesting to think about the different perspectives then and again and how information was kind of perceived. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's again like with a movie like Highlander, that's a weird one because I remember I had to introduce like all my friends into that, like to that film, and
Oh yeah.
they were all into like sci-fi stuff and horror and heavy metal and all this kind of stuff, and it seems like it was tailor-made for them, but none had ever heard of it, and for me it was everything. But so yeah, it's very odd.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. So I highly recommend people like and subscribe to both those podcasts. But the film we're talking about today is Monster Squad, partly because the Monster Squad documentary Wolfman's Got Nards is coming out October 27th. Is that correct?
Hmm.
And you participated in this documentary, so how did that come about?
So I've been a lifelong Monster Squad fan. Again, this is one of those movies that I thought was everything. It
Yeah,
was as soon as I saw it in the theater, it was like, where have you been for all 10 years of my life? And ever since, it's been a movie that I've championed and loved and collected on and off and stuff. And nobody I knew saw it, and so it always surprised me. But over the years, I've like spent a lot of time seeking out whatever I could Monster Squad related, whether it was magazine articles or old Teen Beat magazines that had exposés on Andre Gower or Ryan Lambert. And recently, I started like within the last 5 or 6 years, I started picking up copies of the film on Dead Media. So any VHS copy that I can get my hands on from other countries or weird US VHS releases and stuff like that. I just started amassing the stuff, and I've been sharing it on social media and whatnot. And over the years, I guess I was loud enough that I caught the attention of like Fred Decker and Andre and Ryan Lambert and stuff like this, and just kind of, I don't know. I don't know how many huge like super Monster Squad fans are out there. I know there's a handful that I've met over the years, but I definitely made a lot of noise, I guess. And so when it came time for Andre to start thinking about like what he wanted to do in terms of, he'd been showing the film at film revivals, and he started getting the idea of wanting to do like some kind of a film project around it. And when he landed on the idea of doing like turning the camera around on the fans, I guess I was sort of right up there on the list of people, which I was very flattered by. So he made it a point when he was starting to work on the film to seek me out and sit me down.
That's incredible. I love
Yeah.
that just your own passion that drives you to something. It just seems so pure, I
Hmm.
guess, in the essence of it. Uh, Before we get too far into Monster Squad, I just wanted to say that like I grew up in my father's video store, like I said, and so I like to ask guests about early video store memories. Does anything stand out?
Oh, totally. My parents weren't early adopters, but we were definitely users. So like we didn't own a VCR probably until the late 80s, but
Yeah.
throughout the 80s, as soon as you could rent a VCR from a store, we were doing that every weekend. And I remember it was sort of like a family outing. Every Friday night, we'd hit our local mom and pop that was in a little chain mall that we had with like a grocery
Yeah.
store and stuff. And it was like a little hole in the wall, but they had like they just had a great selection for such a small store. And even so, I had like maybe 5 movies were my go-to movies that I would constantly rent and re-rent.
What were they?
Red Dawn, uh, the 1986 BMX classic Rad.
Yes.
um,
Responsible for many of us loving Send Me an Angel.
oh, totally. I still regret that I didn't do a bike dance at my wedding.
Yeah.
But yeah, Transformers the movie,
Oh yeah.
the toy with Richard Pryor was a
Mm-hmm.
big one, and Monster Squad. As soon
Yeah.
as that hit. But yeah, I used to love going in, and one of my pastimes was just going over into the horror section and just scanning the covers because, oh man, any
Yeah.
VHS level will let you know that the especially the horror covers were just amazing. And
Yeah.
I was gonna say that my parents were I was a second child, and I came pretty late after my sister, so by the time I hit 10, like my parents were just kind of done with discipline and like they were just like, I guess he's fine. So at 10 years old, they let me start renting whatever I wanted to rent. So I got free access renting to the horror section and stuff like that. So I spent a lot of time in all the mom and pop shops, and eventually when they closed down, it was Blockbusters and stuff like that. But constantly, I mean, every weekend I can remember going back until I was like 6, I think, just constantly renting films.
Yeah. That's something that I never thought about was particularly unique or anything, because as children, we just think like everyone's life's like this or
Yeah.
whatever. And then my friend JL that produces the show gave me the book by Thomas Hodge, VHS cover art,
Hmm.
which is a fantastic book. And I opened it and I just felt like I was standing in my childhood home. And I was, looking at these horror covers that, it could be like, oh, that's cool or whatever. But I looked at this like every
Every
day.
day.
Like
Yeah.
it's just like it's in me. Like it affected how I became obsessive over music or vinyl or
Hmm.
DVDs or whatever. It's like and how I pour over the things and read the names and try to find the connections to the other things or whatever. It's everything. So I just love those
Totally.
passionate stories.
It's weird that like I remember being 12 years old and I can't remember. I can't remember if it was full moon at the time, but maybe before they were full moon when they were doing the company that was doing like the oh, what's the crazy vampire movies? The
Oh, it's full moon. You're
yeah,
thinking of not
subspecies.
spookies, subspecies. Yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes.
like all those things. I remember like making the connections between like the Charles Band stuff and those movies and the
Yes.
directors at 12.
Yeah.
Like knowing who Clive Barker was and seeing like Rawhead Rex and
Oh yeah.
Hellraiser and going, "Oh my god, this is the same guy." And at 12 is it's
Yeah.
a weird, but I'm very thankful that I had that opportunity because it like you said, it shaped who I became.
Yeah, yeah. It's just all the practical effects, all the artwork on the boxes, the way that the two things didn't match up.
Hmm.
It was great. It was the big mystery of it all. Yeah, I love it. Um, my next note I have here. Oh, tape collecting. So Jail had told me that you collect these Monster Squad tapes from around the world, like
Hmm.
any that you can find.
Yeah.
How many have you found, do you think?
So the VHS and beta collection is probably, I mean, it's not like a huge. It's sitting at like between 40 and 50 tapes.
I
Um,
mean, it's kind of a lot.
it's kind of a lot, I guess, when you consider that it's all one film.
Yeah,
It's pretty
exactly.
it's pretty crazy. It's not enough to make a plastic throne out of, but it's enough that
Right.
it's too heavy to fit on a shelf.
Yes. Is there do we have alternate titles in different places?
Oh yeah, that's one of my favorite things is finding copies of the movie where they've retitled it. And the hardest copy I've had to find so far, like there's a lot of rare copies from countries that are just hard to find because like Israel or Turkey, where they didn't have a huge booming market, right? So
Yeah.
the tapes just don't exist anymore. You know, whatever tapes were made got thrown away. Whatever, people didn't save them. It's a very different culture than in the U.S. But then there's like countries like France, where it's such a big modernized country. I knew they had to have VHS, but I had the hardest time trying to track down the Monster Squad there, and I couldn't figure out why. And I have friends who live in France who are, similar minded, and I've had them searching for years. And I've got friends that are up in Canada and Quebec trying to like, okay, is there something over here, And the funniest thing was that I eventually stumbled upon it on accident, because it was retitled to the same name as another film that it gets mistaken for in search engines a lot, which is The Monster Club, which is an old like Vincent Price
Oh yeah, yeah.
anthology film.
That's a weird one.
So it was hard to find because I was, it's like it was hiding in plain sight. Um,
So
but
they called it Monster Club in France.
yeah, yeah. So that stuff like
That's
that is
weird.
weird. Or like in Germany where I'm only this is only like me assuming or not thinking too hard about it, but the movie's called The Monster Squad. They wouldn't release it under that title in Germany, and my thought process was that squad had weird connotations to the Nazis or something.
Sure,
So
sure.
they renamed it to Monster Busters, and
Oh,
it's
that's jovial.
yeah, it's and like the movie itself, even the U.S. version kind of cribs the Ghostbusters tagline. So it's kind of funny that it's got that connection too there through Germany. But yeah, I love finding other titles or just foreign variations on the title where
Mm-hmm.
it's like in Italy it's School for Monsters. And
School from
yeah,
just okay.
yeah, so it's
There, some of it does take place in a school, so I'll
yeah.
give them that.
So yeah, that's definitely a fun aspect of it, and it just again just trying to track down because it gets crazy, especially when you're like doing eBay searches or you're doing online searches. It's like what do you look for?
Right.
But then that's half the fun.
Do you have the laser disc?
I do.
Yeah, that seemed like an obvious one.
Yeah, the American one definitely. I love that mostly because it's like old album artwork. It's huge, it's great, and
Yes,
you get a really nice shot of the Craig Nelson poster artwork on it.
it's beautiful.
But probably my pride and joy is the Japanese Laserdisc, and it's because of the connotation of what it has and what it means to the fandom. For a number of years, this movie was only released on VHS, and then it was only released like to video stores. So it was never as a sell through to the public. It was always
Hmm.
marketed to the store. So it was always like $90 a tape or
Yep.
whatnot. And so for the longest time, the only copies that were available, like when we were getting into the DVD age, like if you wanted it on DVD, it was a rip of the VHS.
Hmm.
So it was in full screen, it was pan and scan, yeah, that kind of stuff. The quality was
Yeah.
pretty low. But then all of a sudden, like in 2003, like everywhere, the bootlegs started, the quality like jumped up. And it's because somebody got a hold of the Japanese Laserdisc and ripped it, and it was widescreen, digital quality, and for once you could have like a really nice copy of the movie on bootleg. And so that was huge for me as a fan of the film when that came out. So like I just needed to track down a copy of the Japanese Laserdisc, just knowing what that meant to me before it officially hit DVD and we could have copies a lot easier.
Yeah. Uh, when you said Rawhead Rex, it made me think of a shirt I have that is of the Ghana horror movie poster art.
Oh
Do you
yeah,
guys?
yeah.
Yeah. So I have a Rex, one of those, and I also have Ghoulies 3 because it says Ghoulies go to college. It's really awesome. But do you have any Ghana art of Monster Squad?
I don't. I've seen some floating around online,
Oh,
and
really?
I'm not sure if it's more recent stuff or if it's from back in the '80s. But it's pretty sweet. It's it's it mainly focuses on the Andre Gowrishon character, and it's just great.
Okay. Wow.
That's yeah. I think I have every international poster and everything, and that's one of the ones that it's like I want it, but I'm not sure if it's,
Right.
real or not. A lot of that stuff is like also like, didn't they like either screen print them or do something where they're like actual prints and not like poster replications?
Some of them are. There's a place called Weird War here in Portland, and they had a showing, and they had the actual painted like
Oh, the
burlap.
original, the burlap
Yeah,
canvases.
and it was astounding to see. But I have seen also sort of reproduction type
Okay.
things as well. Um, but I would just like to see the Monster Squad one.
Oh yeah, it's pretty fun. That stuff too. Like when you get into the posters, there's a Mexican poster that is trippy as hell, and this one it's fairly common. I think it's pretty easy to find on the internet, but it's just
Okay.
the it's a Technicolor wonder. The poster, like each monster has its own rainbow color. Like
Oh
Frankenstein is
wow.
purple, and the Wolfman has like weird tints of blue in it and stuff, and the Mummy's kind of pink. And but it's hilarious because the Frankenstein is Boris Karloff. It's that
Oh
Frankenstein.
right.
It's but up in the corner of the poster, there's like a picture of Tom Noonan and his interpretation of Frankenstein. So it's so weird how it got mix mashed and
Wow.
everything. But it's so hilarious for its weirdness. But yeah, that's definitely one of my favorites in my poster
Oh,
collection.
that's great. I'll look that up for sure. Okay, well, let's just talk a little bit about Monster Squad with our time left. First, I wanted to say that I was having a conversation with some people, and they were asking what I was planning for my 31 and 31. You know, people watch 31 horror movies in October.
Mm-hmm.
And the last week is usually where I have sort of the bigger benchmarks. And of course, I consider Monster Squad a perfect film for October. And so I said, you know, of course, Monster Squad, just kind of glancing over it, moving on to like less heard of titles, and everyone was like, "Oh, I haven't seen that," and I was like, "What?" Like, I mean, it blew me away, and my wife was like, "Oh, I haven't seen it either," and I was like, "We've been married 15 years, and I've never shown you Monster Squad." I was like telling her scenes and stuff, and she's like, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." So last night I put it on for her to watch, and the opening scene happens. And you know, in the first 3 minutes, it's like if you're a horror kid, this is the movie for you. Like
Yeah.
they just give it to you right away.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, she's like, "Oh wow, like this is pretty awesome." And then you get into some sort of problematic language, judging going from 2020 to what year did Monster Squad come out?
87. Yeah.
87. And in 87, language was very different,
Yes.
especially in PG-13 comedies. So I do think it's important to bring that up to people that when you are watching something as magnificent as Monster Squad, that it does have some things carried over from 1987 because that's when it was made.
Yeah. And that's I will say, and I'm not trying to make an excuse for the
Sure.
languages in it because it's definitely it's something else in a couple of the scenes.
Yeah.
Um, but the two things I'll say, one is Fred Decker and Shane Black, who wrote and directed the movie, they were really good about tapping into what real kids were like. So,
Mm.
as much as like there's awesome movies like Goonies or The Explorers or Space Camp, a lot of that stuff is very cartoony and over the top. Like Goonies is like uh, the very conceptualized version of what a child would want to be if they had a say in the matter. Like
Yeah.
children just aren't that cool or that stereotypical or whatever. And in the Monster Squad, it's very natural. Like I was
Mm-hmm.
Horace. The clothes, the look, everything. And the kids talked like all my friends talked to me. And it's like Decker was hanging out with a bunch of 10-year-olds at the
Right.
time. So it's very true to life. Unfortunately, that's what life was like in the 80s.
Yeah,
Um,
that was common language then.
yeah. And then on the other hand, and it's just something that I kind of think about now because I was a very heavy kid, and I was heavy for most of my life. So I definitely identify a lot with Horace in the movie. And something that I really identify with is the scene where EJ and Derek are picking on Horace, and some of the stuff that they say comes out. And
Yeah.
what's important to me on a weird level is that it is honest and brutal like that because that's what my experience was like as well. And if it were candy coated or, dumbed down or they weren't as mean
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, it's like it would still hit home, but it wouldn't have that, honest, realistic sting that movie does. And
Yeah.
there's something to be said about that it's like, yeah, it sucks, but it's also that's what the people have to deal with. So you shouldn't have to shy away from it. On the other hand, it's a weird kind of balance thing to think about. So, but yeah, no, it's definitely fair warning to people because I know I've shown it to people and they're like, "What?"
Yeah,
And
because
just
it's happened so abruptly in the beginning of the film, and yes,
mhm.
they do continue to not call Horace Horace for the rest of the film, but it's the homophobic stuff in the beginning.
Yeah,
Uh, it hasn't aged well,
no,
but this happens in fantastic movies, and I think it's important because it brings up the conversation, and like you're talking about the realism of what it was like to be a kid going through those situations, and it is important to have those things represented in films. So
hmm,
it is nice to have it in a movie that's also so awesome.
yeah, exactly.
What are some of the things that really spoke to you about Monster Squad?
So like first and foremost, like I mentioned, it was the first time I sat down and watched a movie and saw myself on screen.
Mm.
And not just in like some weird vehicle character fashion where it's like, oh, this is a young kid who's going through this. Like, I'm a young kid. It's like, no, this
Yeah.
is, again, I wore the TNC shirts. I had the Loud Surf shorts. I had the two different colored sets of Chuck Taylors.
Oh wow.
I was telling my friends that, we shouldn't go out and have BB gun wars, that we should be staying back home and having Math Squad or Nature Squad instead. I didn't go so far as to always have a slice of pizza in my pocket, but, again, I pretty much was Horace, and that was amazing to me. It's like, as much as I wanted to identify with Chunk and Goonies or something like that, it's like, it's not quite the same.
Yeah.
So that was very revealing for me. And the other thing too that just really stood out to me, especially when I was 10, was that I had just started getting into horror movies and just started making my, dipping my toes into the genre. And the thing that this movie does really well is speak to a kid on the level of a 10-year-old, but at the same time, it's a horror movie that can stand alongside all the rest of the horror movies and not feel like it was done down toward kids or spoken down toward. It's the effects are fairly gory, the situations are pretty hairy, and it felt like a real movie that was being made for me. And again, it was this idea that even as a 10-year-old, I realized that like this was important and it was different than a lot of than the movies that were aimed at me.
Yeah, I agree. There was numerous times. It was so fun again to watch it with my wife last night, who had never seen it,
Hmm.
because I was just waiting for each beat to happen so that I could kind of turn and see like, okay, is she, reacting or? And then I just kept saying to her, PG-13,
Yeah.
and she's just like, this is wild. I'm like, yeah, like it felt like an R-rated movie as a kid, because
Hmm.
you have like limbs coming off, Wolfman explodes, I mean, comes back to get, I mean, it's just
And
like
there's plenty of cursing and just
so much cursing, and they're funny too, all the funny lines, all the is it dong or schlong, one of the they're referring to their genitals as is
oh
just,
yeah.
it's, I mean, of course these guys are so good at writing the jokes, but it just feels like there's no missed opportunities in this movie,
Hmm.
and it's also feels really lean, like it just
Yeah.
has a movement to it, and then it just gives you everything, and then it's out.
And again, that this is something that's really cool too, is that if there are fans of Shane Black out there and they know him from stuff like Lethal Weapon or The Nice Guys, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, like this was the first full script that he wrote. It's like he was working on stuff in college and he was friends with Fred Decker. And Decker had the opportunity basically to hand this to him and say, look, I've written the treatment. I've got the story down. This is what I want to get to, but I'm still working on this other film. And I think I kind of need your help to flesh this out. And Shane Black is an amazing scriptwriter. As great as his movies are, if you can get a hold of his scripts, they're 10 times better. They break all the rules of script writing. They do all the things that you're not supposed to do, but it makes them so rich. The script for this film has so many asides where they go in deep depth for like a paragraph into each of the characters, so that like when you get to Rudy, you get an understanding, real understanding of where Rudy stands. Or like even EJ and Derek have like extra stuff to broaden out their characters, and it's a lot of that in shorthand form makes it to the screen because the actors have that and they can work on that. And I think that's another strength of Decker as a director who hasn't gotten a lot of opportunities to direct, unfortunately, but he knows how to utilize what's there and to get the best performances. um I don't know, it's really great, and it is really lean. It's barely an hour and a half. It's like an hour and 22, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember, I mean, I watched so many movies as a kid, they don't all stick out. But Monster Squad, I could tell you where I was. I could tell you what flavor of sweet tart I was eating. Like it was
Hmm.
like, it was a huge a huge deal. And again, to turn to a group of people that are similarly aged as me and to say Monster Squad and not have them be like, oh, and have a quote, on
On
hand.
it. Yeah.
Instead, they're just like, what? And I was like, am I crazy? Like, this feels like the Twilight Zone right now.
Yeah.
Like,
It's
you
that
guys all agreed to pretend that it's not the
it
coolest
exists. Yeah.
thing ever.
It's so crazy too. Going back and thinking about it, this movie was only in theaters for 2 weeks. And it's not
Mm-hmm.
even technically 2 weeks. It was like a weekend, a full week, and a weekend. And then all the theaters across the country yanked it. And I've done weird research into this, looking up into the movie sections of all these papers, and it's like it just disappears off the face of the earth after like August 22nd.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and it did have a much better life on VHS, but I think it hit a target audience on VHS, but it wasn't like the same as like a movie that was like in the 80s when something did even relatively well, it was in the theater for months, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And to have such a short window, it's like I both get it on retrospect and looking back and thinking about it in those terms, but again, at the time it's like why aren't all my friends quoting this movie, and didn't
Yeah,
they all see this? Because yeah.
the poster alone, I'm like, this has everything.
It literally has the Mount Rushmore of monsters on it.
Yeah, I don't understand. Also, I love the creature design.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Gill Man from Creature from the Black Lagoon has always been my favorite creature design, and
Mm-hmm.
I love the one in Monster Squad.
Yep. The one of the best things that could have ever happened to Monster Squad is when they lost the Universal license, and then Stan Winston and his crew had to find a way to work around that. And again, this is the same crew that worked on Aliens. This is the same crew that worked on Terminator and Predator, and it was all at this one condensed time. And Monster Squad seems like such a left field project for them, but they
Yeah.
still put their all into it, and they were able to do things with these creatures that like past iterations couldn't do. And as much as I love the imagery of like the Karloff mummy, right?
Yeah.
You really just see Ardith Bay through most of the movies, and the mummy's just kind of here and there.
Yeah.
But Michael McKay's mummy and his just decrepit, thin, shambling, it's like that's the mummy. It's like
Yeah.
Hammer's mummy was like a weird bodybuilder. Christopher Lee's mummy was just huge and built and weird, and yeah, like the creature is menacing. Again, I'm
Uh-huh.
the same way. Like my favorite Universal horror is the creature, and I
Yeah.
love those movies and the subtext and everything. But man, were they able to make him so much more menacing
Yeah.
in the
He's a
Monster Squad?
formidable creature in this
Yeah.
one. And I love all the mummy gags. Since you mentioned the mummy, the part with the unraveling in the
Mm-hmm.
truck, I was like, watch, 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 watch. And my wife's like, geez, like I get, like, and I'm like, no, 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 but this was so cool, and it is. It's an awesome little. I mean, I don't even understand how they did it, but it's pretty great. And Wolfman, the classic Wolfman's got nards.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what I said to probably, I guess, my whole life. A bunch of people that didn't know what I was talking about.
I had this argument leaving the theater with a friend I saw the film with, who he just in his brain he had he didn't realize they said nards, and for me it was like this was now the iconic line that I wanted to get tattooed on my body.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it was funny. I just remember on the car ride home, like, remember when he said kick the Wolfman in the balls? I'm like, no, 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 I'm pretty sure he said nards. And but yeah, no, and I love that too. Again, like the fact that they give the kids time to shine with these monsters and things that
Yeah,
kids would absolutely love, kick them in the nards. But at the
yeah.
same time, man, there's some really impressive werewolf transformations and stuff
Yes.
that rivals American Werewolf and The Howling, and it's just as freaky and weird and scary. And that the guttural wolf noises that this
Oh
werewolf
yeah.
makes is like off the scale.
Yeah, that the transformation, I think it's the second one, was one of the points where I turned to my wife and I was like, "This is PG-13.
Yeah.
Like that is pretty terrifying and amazing."
Hmm.
I love that, and for the reason like you said, they weren't talking down to you. They weren't like,
Hmm.
"Let's make it kind of like for a kid." They were like Joe Dante up there, like being like, "This is gonna scare the crap out of you," but like
Yep.
that's what we're gonna do. I
I
love it.
also love that they made pains to like make sure that like they were fans of these horror characters and the Universal stuff, and they were like, look,
Yeah.
what would a fan want to see, right? And there's some deleted scenes in the film and everything, but they made sure that like pretty much all the monster characters, they come at them from an angle where it's like, this is something a fan always wanted to do with this character. Like when you talked about the mummy unraveling the way that he does, it's like
Yeah.
every fan is like, what would happen,
Mm-hmm.
if you unravel the
Mm-hmm.
mummy? And again, there's a deleted scene, but like Dracula ends up getting staked 3 times in this movie.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, it's like that thing where it's like, is it the stake that kills him, or is it like, if you get into the real mythos of it, no, you have to cut his head off and burn the body and blah blah blah. So it's like there's things like that in here. It's like, what would happen if you shot the creature? What is it that
Right.
stops the creature? And like they literally have a test about, well, how do you kill a werewolf?
Yeah.
I love that stuff makes it into the movie.
Yeah, I know it's so smart, and everything they do with Frankenstein's monster.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I still get emotional over the end.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's so well done. I mean, the balance of tone, both comedic and horrific, and that sequence for it to still have some kind of depth. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's really impressive.
Yeah. And again, and I don't know how much of this was Decker or the casting agents or whatnot, but they did a really good job of finding people to portray these monsters that took this job really seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Duncan Regehr and Tom Noonan particularly went full method on this movie, and Duncan would not let the kids see him until he was, ready to shoot a scene so that he could, like be menacing and frightening to them, at the time. Yeah, Ashley Bank as Phoebe did not know he was going to do half the things he did when he
Oh,
got to that
really?
scene. It was basically just like, just react like you would react. And so when you see her screaming, she's screaming. And Tom Noonan was like super crazy method with his Frankenstein, where he had to obviously stay in the makeup the whole day.
Yeah.
And so like between scenes of filming and everything, like Ryan Lambert would try to hang out with him and just have a conversation, like learn some stuff about an older actor. And he stayed in Frankenstein mode the entire time. So he would only reply to him as like Frankenstein would. And I know at the time Lambert said it was like maddening, but
Oh,
it
that's
brings,
so fun.
yeah, it brings a level to this film that, it doesn't necessarily have to be there, but it's pretty cool that it was.
Yeah. Oh, that's I love that he would just be giving him like one word answers
Yep.
for hours. Oh my gosh. That's incredible. Uh, well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but
Sure.
before, I just want to remind people that Wolfman's Got Nards comes out the 28th,
27th. Yeah.
27th, and that's just on all digital platforms. I'm
I believe
imagining.
it's video on demand on platforms, so I'm assuming you can rent it from like Amazon or iTunes. And it's also Blu-ray, DVD.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so hard copy if you want to own that. And that's
Yes.
pretty much everywhere where you can pre-order media right now. And in fact, if people are fans of Fred Decker, if you go to Dark Delicacies, they have a version of the Blu-ray that's going to be signed by Fred Decker for only like $10 more. It's
Oh,
pretty cool.
well, yeah. I'm gonna get that for sure. And before we sign off, lastly, Jael told me that on your website you either used to have or still do stills of bedrooms from the 80s films, and you listed items that were in the rooms.
Oh yeah, that was a fun
Can you
like
tell
sort
me
of thing.
about that?
Yeah. So again, trying to find ways to look at things that don't, always whatever. Everyone talks about like The Princess Bride or Flight of the Navigator, The Goonies or whatever, and hits upon those same topics again and again and again. So I was like, well, how can I, like, if I'm going to look at The Goonies, how can I tackle this from a perspective that maybe hasn't been done yet? So I got this idea. There's a couple other writers out there. Matt at Dinosaur Dracula did one, and uh, Freddie Squires from Freddie in Space, back when he used to have a blog. He did like a Friday the 13th room breakdown or whatever. So I just thought it would be fun to like look into the kids' bedrooms in movies and see like what's there.
Yeah.
And part of this, I'm not going to call it a superpower, but I have this weird OCD thing. Like when I'm watching movies, I have like a hyper awareness that kicks in where I'm paying attention to the plot and everything that's going on, but at the same time, like I'm focusing on everything in the background. It's really weird. I kind of like split my attention, and I tend to notice things like when I'm watching movies with my wife or with my friends. Like when it's over, I'll be like, "Did you see this thing that was in the background at this, in this scene?" And they're like, "What? What are you even talking about?" So I
That's
wanted
so
to put that to
funny.
use because I can't turn that part of my brain off.
Yeah.
So I took a bunch of sort of iconic 80s kids films, the ones where you got pretty decent shots of bedrooms and stuff like that, and just kind of took a bunch of screenshots as the camera was traveling through the room and just kind of centered on everything that was in that kid's room. So like if you take like Sarah from Adventures in Babysitting, and it's kind of neat because you get a different appreciation for the character kind of based on what you find in the room. So
Right.
if anyone's familiar with Adventures in Babysitting, they know that Sarah's a huge fan of Thor, and that comes up a lot in the film. But like when you're traveling through her room, like all of her toys are boys' toys. She has a bunch of Transformer stuff and a My Pet Monster, and it's like also like weird obscure stuff too. So it's just kind of fun to pick out all these little things, and it can give you a new appreciation for a film. So like the next time you sit down to watch it, you're like, oh wow, there's Garbage Pail Kids on the wall here that I never
Yeah.
noticed before.
Oh,
Man
Mad Balls.
figures. Yeah, yeah, Mad Balls everywhere.
That's awesome. That's really, and that's on your
Yeah, that's on branded. I have a
Right.
couple weird columns. I also like make alternative movie trading cards for movies that never had them. I design stuff sort of as like a part-time job thing. So I thought it would be fun for like movies like The Monster Squad and stuff that never got trading card sets. It's like
Oh.
if they don't have
So
them, I'll just make them myself.
that's on your website. That's the These Should Exist or something like that?
Mhm.
I thought those were real.
Thank you. That's
Those are really good designs.
Thank you. That's the best compliment that I could hope to receive. Actually, is I try to make them look like they're something that actually
They really
existed.
do. Like I had just looked at it and I was like, "Oh, I bet this is like things like that he wished were real." And then I clicked on it, I was like, "Oh no, this is just really rad stuff." Oh, that's great. Well,
Yeah.
people should definitely check that out as well,
Thank
for
you.
sure. Well, thank you, Sean, for your time. The documentary comes out October 27th, and people should like and subscribe to Cult Film Club and Branded in the 80s. And this is VHS.